There we go. Let's do an audio check. Now everybody can hear us.
Alright.
There we go. Good. You're good. Well, today is Monday, and today is the 10th. It is May, Electrical Safety Month, and today's a special day because you are the first inductee to the Buck 41 Club.
Alright.
Audio's good. So we got Ryan Jackson viewing. You know Ryan?
I know, Ryan.
Oh, yeah. So, Mr. Dollar, Jimmy, Electrical Safety Month. And your perspective, you drive safety. You do a lot in the National Electrical Code, 70E. We got Felix Sandoval, everything. So what I wanted to do was share your passion for safety. And I know you've driven a lot of stuff into the National Electrical Code, driving safety for the electrical worker. And I know there's probably people out there that don't know you. I know we've done programs together, but can you give everybody just a little bit of your background and help to help? I think that is your background helps establish the foundation for why it is what you do.
Okay. All right. I'm a 40-year member of IBEW Local 98. So I'm a journeyman wireman, spent a lot of years in the field. Then worked as starting in 95 as a full-time instructor in IBEW Local 98, teaching codes and standards and safety. I was appointed to Code-Making Panel 15 in 1997. So I've been a member of NFPA 70, the NEC committees, for many, many years. I'm a past member of the NEC Correlating Committee. I dropped off of that as a retired member. That's just too much. I'm still on Code-Making Panel 10, which has purview over overcurrent protection in Article 240. I chaired that committee in 2002, 2005, and 2008, and still a member of CMP 13, which has a very wide purview from generators to batteries, fire pumps, emergency legally required, optional, COPS, and more. And I'm a longstanding member of the NFPA 70E committee, as well as a member of the UL Electrical Council. So that has, I've been privileged to be placed in those positions because it is a privilege to serve in those positions. And it has put me in a very unique spot to be able to share that with all of the people that I come in contact with when I do training. In 2001, I became the safety coordinator for IBEW Local 98. And that took me down a completely different path. And unfortunately, during that period of time, I had to do 3 fatality investigations. And it's not easy to do a fatality investigation. And it's even harder when you know the individual and the family. So safety means a lot to me. I represent labor. And for those of you that don't know, you can go into the back of the NEC and you can take a look at all of the classifications. So if you see an L, it means safety in the workplace. That's my job at the table on the NEC committees. That's my job at the table at 70E. We've got M's for manufacturers, IMs, installer maintainers. We've got U's for utilities, and then there's a user category. So, the representation is wide. And in addition to playing a role on those committees, I've always been very active in submitting my ideas. And in many cases, the ideas that I began to develop and run with actually came from another meeting or a class, a discussion, if you will, that takes you down a new road. And we can't be afraid to think outside the box. We can't be afraid to say no, that that's not what we do. Unfortunately, in the NEC process, there's a lot of that.
Yeah.
And you take a look at some really good ideas, for example, that have been submitted to Code-Making Panel 5, and their substantiation for not doing it is that this is a long-standing code rule.
Yeah.
So I would really like somebody to tell me what the heck that means.
Yeah, I hear you. And you know what? So that's when I structured this Buck 41 Club, it started as a way to say, how do you recognize people like yourself because you speak up? And I think that's a very important part of the whole picture. And what you said that some of these ideas come up from discussions, right? You might have been on a job site where you're looking at a situation, right? Or it could have been just a discussion with somebody trying to figure out what a current requirement is, or looking at a situation saying, I don't think this looks right, And then to your point, I mean, I know I've made public inputs in the past where it got rejected, and you say, well, geez, I thought I had the right substantiation. I had the body counts, etc. And yet it wasn't passed for whatever reason. But it is thinking out of the box. It's so how do you, so what's the right, I mean, you've been very successful. I mean, when I look back at the different public inputs and I see your name on things like 24087, working space for the electrical worker, you didn't get there right away on some of those, right?
Yeah.
So it's like surge. I remember back, and I think it was 11 cycle or even earlier, you made a public input for surge on dwelling units, and you didn't get it. But then we just got it in the 2020 cycle, so that's like 9 years later, right, or
Yes,
more.
and well, there's a couple of things that have to happen. One, you need to be persistent. If you've got an idea, you have to keep running with it. But you have to learn. And it was difficult for me when I was first a committee member to learn that. When I went in, for example, on my first committee to code making panel 15, and I looked at a proposal that I wanted to become code, I wanted all of it. I wasn't willing to settle for 50% of it or 25% of it. But after a period of years, and some experience and getting your butt kicked, you begin to learn that, what, I'd rather walk away with two pieces out of 10
Yeah.
than walk away empty handed. You learn that. You
Yep.
learn that. And it takes time. It's difficult for a committee member to realize that. And the other piece is that as we, and you and I've been friends for many years, as we code guys, as we have discussions, we mold each other's opinions. Not
Yeah.
immediately, it doesn't happen that day, but we mold each other's opinions. For example, I could have a discussion with you after we get done here today, and I could be on the left side of the fence and you're on the right side of the fence, and we hang the phone up, and 2 weeks later, I might think, you know what? Tom is right. Now,
Yeah.
there's one thing for certain, I would never tell you. You would mold and that's what happens. And you begin to do that with a committee. And then there's other things that you need to do. For example, the personnel door thing, we were able to get that down to 800 amps. That was at
Yes.
1200 amps. Well, the first thing we had to do was separate the personnel doors into a second level subdivision by itself outside of large equipment. So,
Hmm.
there's a method to your madness. It's a 3-6 year plan.
Yep.
And then the following cycle, I wanted to reduce from 1200 to 800. And the committee told me no, that I hadn't provided any substantiation to do that. And then I went back. You just got to keep sharpening your pencil. I went back into the proposals, the ROPs, and went way back and found the ROPs that drove the personnel door piece. And there was never an ampacity rating tied to it. And they didn't know where to put it. So they said, where would this best fall? They said, we'll throw it in with large equipment at 1200 amps. So the following cycle, when I sent in, and if you chase this down, if anybody wants to take a look at it, and this is what's really interesting. In the following cycle, I went from 1200 to 800 and explained to the committee in a very nice way that, when you guys did this many years ago, you didn't know where to put it. They just threw it in with large equipment. Well, if you read the panel statement to move to 800 amps,
Hmm.
code making panel 1, which is probably the toughest nut to crack out of 19, all right?
Hmm.
In their statement, there's a sentence that says, we don't know why the submitter didn't go lower than 800 amps. So one cycle, they slammed the door shut at
Yeah.
1200. And the next one, they said,
Yep.
well, why did you stop at 800?
That's exactly right.
And there's a reason for that. It's all about survivability.
Yes.
And survivability is what most people don't look at when they submit an idea, a public
That's right.
input. you have to say, how far can I push the envelope and still get 2/3 of that committee?
And a lot of people ask me like, why 1200 amps in 24087, or why 800 amps? And we could have the discussion debate and say it should be lower. Yeah. But survivability is very critical.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And arc energy reduction, that idea came to me, and it didn't first come up as arc energy reduction. I
Right.
wanted to deal with what I called non-instantaneous trip circuit breakers. And if you go back, that's what it was titled.
That's right.
And that came to me as I was flying home from a 70E committee meeting. And we were dealing with exposures with low voltage power circuit breakers that didn't have an instantaneous trip. And the engineers at the tables basically said, well, hey, labor, you just got to suck it up and hope you can get out of the way in 2 seconds. And that didn't give me a warm and fuzzy. And as I was flying home, I was reading an article about the Mars rover, and it said that the Mars rover was 10 feet long, 9 feet wide, 7 feet high, and weighed 2,600 pounds. And when I thought to myself, if we could put that on Mars, we got to be able to figure this out.
Absolutely right. And this was your public input here, 10-82. And this was just the public input. So the original was short time delay. They ended up with non-instantaneous trip.
Yes.
Yes. And then this you had a very extensive a substantiation. You went through all of the different options, and you know what I saw. So I went back through some of your public inputs. I mean, as far back as I could go in preparation for this, and I saw basically to your point. You could see in your public inputs and your substantiation how you started to get more. All right, I had a lesson learned. How do I modify my public input?
Yes.
And I know you do a very good job of communicating well before you crafted that language.
Yeah, and I mean it's the only way that it works.
Yeah.
You have to find out, for example, with the manufacturing community, how does this impact you? And the 1,200 amp number was actually arrived at working with the manufacturers to limit, when it first went in, the number of devices that would be impacted by this rule. If the 2023 holds up, that 1,200 drops down to 1,000.
Which I remember a guy who presented to panel 13 or panel 10 and suggested 1,000 amps.
That's right. I remember that guy too.
And I remember my first time I met you. I was presenting on selective coordination, and this speaks to your point of positions changing after discussions. I presented on selective coordination to panel 13, and I remember going through my slide deck, and Dawn Bliss, I think, was chair.
That's right.
And Dawn said, "Any questions?" And nobody was raising their hand, and you raised your hand, and you said, Thomas, you said, Mr. Dimitrovich, I think you even said, Mr. Dimitrovich, you said, thanks for presenting. I really appreciate it. It was a very thorough presentation, and you proceeded to unravel my presentation. And as you were talking, I was in that realization mode that, you know what, this guy is right. And we had the discussion. What I wanted didn't go through because of the obvious stuff, right? And then I remember meeting you up back at the coffee pot, and I said, Jim, I want to thank you. And you went, for what? Because you just whooped me in there, right? And I said, I want to thank you for not undressing me more than you could have in front of that panel. But It was that moment where, and I have a lot of these. I mean, we all do. But sometimes they're hard to admit, because when we dig our heels in so much, where we sit down and go, you know what? He got a point. And you're right. I probably would never tell you, but I told you that day because I was like, you were absolutely right. And I went back and then you and I started talking a little bit more, because I'm like, okay, let's try to understand this more. And this was before you come out with 24087. Because my biggest concern on selective coordination was the higher incident energy. And then 24087 sort of just deflated my issues because when I was teaching the same thing, I'm like, if you're going to do this, then you got to address the incident energy. If you're going to put intentional delays in, and to your point, that short time delay, that breaker without an instantaneous, that presents a challenge for the electrical worker. And 24087 was awesome.
Yeah, and we have run, and I've been down this road with you as well with some of your ideas. We've been down the road where somebody comes up with a great idea,
Mm-hmm.
and they say, I'm going to throw this into, one really good example is Article 408. All
Yeah.
right, so you go into 408 switchboards, and switchgear always had, well, I'm not exactly sure how far back, but as far as I can remember, a requirement that said if they were used as service equipment, you had to provide protection from inadvertent contact for those line side connections in a switchboard or switchgear. And then we added panel boards, which was logical.
Yeah.
And then what we did was, you know what? As smart as all the people on the code committees are, we said, well, what about a transfer switch that is
Yeah.
rated suitable for use as service equipment? What about a circuit breaker enclosure or a fuse disconnect?
Yeah.
So then we had to move it to 23062. So there's a lot of that that goes on.
Yeah.
And we are all, each and every one of us, we are all students of the code. We're learning new things every day. And when you stop learning about the code, if you're into it, when you stop learning new things, it's time to get out.
Yeah.
And we have something to learn from everybody, even if it's how not to do it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And then I think, from what if I just look at my buck 41 idea concept, right? You had the penny, which you share your information, the nickel, you actually do something about it, but also you said the right thing. I know there were times when you see a good idea. Like like I was trying to get a change with regard to the inlets on generators. I tried, and I can remember that's the only time I ever had a chair tell me to shut up and sit down. Don Bliss, God love him,
Yep.
because I was like so frustrated, and because I'm watching my idea go down in flames, and then you walked over and you said, "Let's talk about it," because I was not even in the right article.
No.
And then but that's the other thing is sharing and helping other people succeed to help us all work together to increase safety, because everybody gains out of that whole. I mean, most everybody gains. I mean, granted, there might be something that will increase safety that I might have to go back to a product line and say, hey, we're gonna have to shift gears a little bit here, and we, the code handles stuff like that, but it's a process, and we're all students, and we all have to learn from each other, and we all have to work together, period, to make it happen.
Sometimes you just have to walk away, take your name off of it, because sometimes people tie
Yeah.
your name to it. I tried for 3 cycles in a row because to get a requirement for over 150 volts to ground, 480, 277
Yep.
volt systems, service equipment for temporary power, to get a requirement there for current limitation. And the reason that I went there was I saw multiple serious burn downs on temporary power.
Yeah.
And I knew that if we had current limiting fuses or a current limiting circuit breaker, because they're available as well, that it wouldn't have happened. And this last cycle, I sent it in again in the public input stage, and it didn't make it. So I had Donnie Cook send the comment.
Yeah, yeah,
And it went in.
yeah. But that's the thing. Here's what happened, and I do this a lot too. I'll teach on stuff, or I share my ideas, and I'll tell people, hey, it would be great to see a public input in it, because I know if I put it in, people are going to look at me and say it's self-serving.
Yes.
Especially if it's like a GFCI or something like that. But if you sat down and said, look, this is a hazard, and you have a lot of people in our industry that'll shake their head yes, it's like you got to encourage them, put something in on it, because it'll be more survivable, to your point, if they do it, as opposed to if I put it in. People look at me as a manufacturer, or they may even look, like you say, they may look at you and say, hey, I know what he's trying to do here, or I don't know what he's trying to do, but maybe they just don't like you, or they don't like me.
And that could be the other piece is, You have to be able to sell your idea. And I can tell you as a committee member that I do a lot of preparation work. I mean, when we show up at a meeting, that's that's literally the smallest part of the work. The task group work and all of the prep before you get there
Yep.
is just significant. And I can tell you that with regularity, I take a look at a public input and I say my position on this is due west. And during the discussion, when I hear how it impacts other people, or the submitter is there and
Yeah.
they're able to elaborate on their idea and we're able to ask them questions. In many cases, I change from west to north or south. It would be unusual to go 180 degrees and go
Sure.
east, but that does happen.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. In fact, on the
Does happen.
inlet, on that inlet one, I can recall on panel 13, I can't remember, it was the guy from IEEE. What's his name?
Mario.
Mario, that's right. Mario, he threw up a picture and he said, the way this is written, it would impact this. And you looked at me and you said, is that your intention? I was like, no, that wasn't my intention. And he was right. And my language wasn't baked yet. So it was like, okay, I threw in the towel. I'm like, okay, I get it, and then we had to go back to the drawing board and that's when you and I sat down and I said, hey, help me figure this out. And that's how we work together, and now Ryan says the public inputs and public comments should be able to be submitted anonymously. Um, I don't know. I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I believe it's a public process.
Yep.
So they have to come in and it's gotta have a name on it. I mean, it's gotta have it, an organization if there is an organization.
Yeah.
Once you begin to do that, I my personal opinion is that the consensus process begins to suffer. And nobody's name gets put on that first revision or that second revision.
Right.
Nobody's name is there. And I can tell you that I chair a lot of task groups, and you've been on many of them.
Mm-hmm.
And there is not when I'm involved, there is no one on that task group that's going to say something like, oh, here's another one from so and so, because that doesn't play.
Right.
We take a look at every individual and every for for decades, there was a gentleman named Dan Leaf. Remember him?
Oh, yes, I do.
Yeah, and he sent in some really crazy stuff, but you know what? Every now and then,
You got a hit.
man, he'd hit it out of the park.
Yeah, you're absolutely
So
right.
you really had, and you know what? There's a guy, right? Just like we just lost Ray Weber, and
Yeah.
we could go on and on and on with all of the icons in the industry that have gone before us. But you know what? They saved lives.
Absolutely.
And that's what happens at the table. Or, take a look at GFCIs and AFCIs. That's just one example.
Yeah.
And somebody says, well, you know what? They cost a lot of money. Compared to the cost of a home, they don't cost a lot of money.
It's
Right?
true.
Are they saving a lot of lives? You better believe it. We can take
Yeah.
a look at CPSC data and see that the numbers are going down.
Yep.
But the thing is this, we get a call when a life is lost. We don't get a phone call when a life is saved.
That is exactly right. That is exactly right. And that's why, I published a video of Mr. Chioda talking about his experience with an AFCI tripping and then what he found and the problem that he solved. And I put that up. We videoed him. We videoed the electrician who worked on his house. We videoed Joe Fellow who took the call, because you got to document those, because nobody talks about when a product, when an application, having two doors to a room, right?
Yes.
The whole change that you just put, that I know you were I think you did the public input on looking at the addition, adding up to 1200 amps and more, as opposed to just
Yes.
going off the
That was
equipment.
mine. Because the hazard is one and the same.
Right. So, but
Yeah.
nobody ever documents the fact that an event occurred, and because that door was there, I was able to get out of that room. We always document the cases of either somebody who died. I mean, the statistics. That's what drives statistics. And unfortunately, how many people die or go to the hospital or whatnot. But if a non-event is never documented.
Absolutely. Another one that's interesting to follow that and there was many that went before me, Ray Jones and others,
Yep.
that tried to get uh, incident energy labeling somehow into the NEC. It's
Yeah.
difficult. It's difficult because you got a line in the sand between 70E and the NEC. So 110.16B, we backed off. We said, okay, 1200 amps. And we backed off even further. We said, we'll limit it to just service equipment.
Yep.
And it made it. And the following cycle, I personally didn't send anything in there to modify it and it made it again. So now this cycle, it looks like it's going to get expanded to services and feeders
Feeders.
and down to 1,000.
Yeah.
So that's significant. And those things, that tied with a means to provide arc energy reduction through an energy reduction maintenance switch
Yep.
or some other means, that's going to save lives. People don't realize that in an arcing event, the time is directly proportional to the energy. If you can cut the time in half, you cut the energy in half. If you
Yep.
can cut the time down to a tenth, you cut the energy down to
Yeah.
a tenth. So, they're lifesavers is what they are. And that's what it's really all about.
And that is true. People ask me what I do, and I'll say it, but you say we save lives, and in reality, that's what we do. I mean, when you can change an industry, and that's what the dime represents. And it takes a long time because
Oh, yeah.
in you and I do 70E presentations together. We talk about the culture, about how we used to do business as opposed to how we do business today. That doesn't change. You don't change an industry or a culture on the
No,
dime.
no. And if anybody wants to chase the surge protection piece in Article
Yeah.
230, you could chase that and look at some of the comments that came in to say, no, don't do this. But those comments said, hey, these surge protective devices cost money.
That's
Well,
right.
if your AFCIs and your GFCIs lose the ability to sense, right, well, and your house burns down or somebody gets electrocuted, well, that
Mhm.
costs money too.
Yep. And
So it's interesting to watch the position that uh, submitters take.
yeah,
And when when you see somebody that's been doing it for a long time, you see some really well-written language, some well-substantiated language. But the thing, those of you that might be listening to this and you've got an idea and you're going to submit it, well, don't be afraid to take a fallback position. Just get a piece of that.
right.
Get a piece of it this cycle, get a piece of it next cycle. And you know what? You come up with a 9-year plan and you got where you wanted to be 9 years later. That's far better than 9 years later being empty-handed.
That is exactly right. And when I look at this, so you brought up surge, and I look at the 230, 225. This goes back to like 2011, I believe, or maybe even earlier than that. And when I look at the substantiation, it was basically the same type of language that was used in 230 to require surge for residential dwelling units, and it really, I think somebody else said this, that as time goes on, people have different opinions of things because as we talk about surge, we talk about loss, we start looking at data, and just people get more and more educated on the topics. And then it's like, you know what, that's not a bad idea. Let's take a jolly road, walk down that road, and then now you've got something, but it takes
There's
time.
there's there's been a number of those. Many years ago, the first one that we had one of our members, this is many years ago, this is going back around 96, 97,
Yep.
and they were replacing some fixtures in a commercial tenant space. And
Yep.
they went in and they would go into the room, and OSHA actually permits it because it's construction. And subpart K isn't worth the paper that it's written on. If you're looking to get into safety with OSHA requirements, go to subpart S in 1910. And you're permitted to render inoperative, and taping a switch down, OSHA considers rendering inoperative. Well, they saw a switch that they hadn't seen before. It said on, off, auto. So
Ooh.
they put it in the off position. What was a triac driven device. And what happens is you bleed current through resistance and capacitance in the switch
Yep.
through the ballast of the fixture creates a voltage drop so that the motion sensor stays active, which means after you take the last fixture out, you've got line voltage
Wow.
through an impedance, but you've got line voltage.
Wow.
So it failed in the cycle. But the way that I wrote the comment, I actually got a phone call that said, "Hey, there's a task group being put together with a predetermined outcome, and there's going to be a requirement to completely disconnect."
Wow.
So that's how we got there. So you buy a motion sensor today that says on off auto. Off means open.
Right.
Yeah, so there's so many little things, but again, there's so many players in the industry that I have rubbed elbows with over the years that
Mhm.
did so much, and their legacy lives on.
Yeah.
And Ray Weber, I'm just bringing his name up because we just lost
We just
Ray
lost him.
last week,
Yeah.
and you know his fingerprints are all over the code book, and those requirements continue to save lives today. So
Yep.
his legacy lives on.
Absolutely. He was chair of panel two. I remember him when he was chair of panel two, and the great state of Wisconsin.
A great he started whenever you went around the room and said, just introduce yourself.
Yep.
And I would say Jim Doward, Philadelphia IBEW 98. He'd say Ray Weber from the great state
State
of Wisconsin.
Absolutely. You knew he was in the room. That's for
Well, he had
sure.
that booming voice too.
Yes, he
I mean,
did.
it was unmistakable. But you
Absolutely.
know what? He was a teddy bear, man. He was a
Yeah.
good guy.
I know. I know. I
He
know.
really was.
But so what do you have as far as, I mean, you came up through IBW, came up through, like you say, a journeyman, etc. You got into codes and standards. If there's somebody out there, whether they're in IBEW or wherever else, how does somebody get into helping impact and increasing safety through codes and standards? Is that a mental decision that you set your sights on, or what would you
Well,
recommend?
I mean, I was personally involved in submitting proposals and comments back then for many cycles. I mean, we learned to do it as apprentices,
Ah,
and if you stay interested in it and you
yeah,
continue to follow it, multiple things are going to happen. If you get involved at that level, your understanding of the National Electrical Code and the changes as they come down the pike is going to be at an incredible level because when you know the story, all right, when you know the whole story behind it, much easier to explain, understand, and
yeah,
apply. But anybody that wants to get involved, I would highly recommend. It's tough to get a spot on a committee. You've either,
yeah.
got to get in with, for example, the IAEI and the inspectors, or through labor, or through, the IEC or
Right.
NECA or IEEE. So uh, to some, those doors just don't open. But that doesn't mean you can't play a big role. You can play an extremely big role because you can drive it through public inputs and public comments. And for example, there's Don Guinier. He's on your
Oh yeah.
uh,
Yep.
blogs all the time, and Ryan Jackson, right?
Yep.
So we see a lot of public inputs and public comments. Now, I forget what the issue was, and I know you mentioned Ryan's name, but I was chairing, and I think you were on the calls, uh, uh, Article 240,
Oh yeah.
and we also did the Article 230 stuff.
Yep.
So an idea that Ryan had, came up with, they said no, and we're going to write a resolve statement. Two later, they were saying yes, and I said, well, now you got to go back and accept that other one.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, so because it just made sense.
Yeah.
But you know, the code making committees aren't infallible. That much I can tell you.
Yeah. That's true.
I remember when I first sat down at code making panel 15, I was in awe, and I sat there the first half day and really didn't get in. And I began to realize that I knew a lot about the whole code. And a lot of the people at the table, they were experts.
Hmm.
They were experts in their little niche, but they didn't know the whole code.
Yeah.
And that makes a really, really big difference.
That is exactly right, because now you could see how things interrelate with each other. And like, you can have a good idea here, but then you got to realize, well, how's that going to impact somewhere else? Because if you don't think about that, and your involvement with the correlating committee helps with that oversight as well to get that big picture. But that doesn't mean just because you're, like you said, just because you're not on a committee, that doesn't mean you can't get engaged.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I know we're getting close in time here, but there's another piece. It's an interesting piece, and that is be careful what you wish for.
That's true.
Because
Yes.
you might just get it. And then, for example, there was one guy that wanted to use the equipotential bonding grid around the pool as a grounding electrode, right?
Mhm.
And that's not going back that far.
Yep.
And the committee didn't agree with that. As a matter of fact, they said that that's prohibited from being used as a grounding electrode, which was a good move.
Sure. But if you were doing that and you were skating by because you were making those arguments and winning locally, then you went to the National Electrical Code and they said, oh, not no. Oh, heck no. Right?
Oh, heck no.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So
and that happens. That happens. I mean, you can skate something through and get a little piece in the public input stage, and then if you try to blow it wide open in the comment stage, sometimes you'll lose it all.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Well, Mr. Dollard, Jimmy, thank you for taking time out of your evening, buddy.
You got it.
I'm going to send you a $1.41. So I got it. I got it right here.
You know what? Hang on to that $1.41 because you know what? COVID's wrapping up, and I'll let you buy me like a $6 beer.
No. I'm only going to give you a $1.41. Absolutely, that's part of the deal.
All right. Well, hey, it was fun, and
yes.
I hope you have a lot of fun doing more of these.
We will definitely do that. So thank you. Be safe tonight. I know you're going to go fix a shelf or something. So tell everybody I said hey, and thanks again, and thanks for everybody out there for joining us in. Thanks Ryan. Thanks Richard Curran, Scott Taylor, Felix Sandoval. We're international, Jim. We were international.
We're all over the place.
We're all over the place, and we got Egypt, Nihad El Sharif. So
all right.
So thank you, Jim. Thanks everybody out there. Appreciate everybody, and we're going to sign off. So take care and welcome to the $1.41 Club, Jim.
All right, you guys have fun.
We're going to try the best I can. We'll see you. And I'm going to mute.